Chapter 16. The Visit. Now and then there would be a death in the ward. The body would be tagged, then trundled away on a wheel cart, which, with gallows humor, was referred to as the happy wagon. One of those taken away in the thing was a soldier whose bed was across the aisle from mine. He had suffered severe head and leg wounds, and had never regained consciousness after being brought to the hospital. One afternoon he began making an odd rowing motion with his arms. For hours he kept it up. It was very strange. Almost as though unconscious, he was rowing away, off into another world, the next world. He rowed far into the night. The next morning he was gone. And another man, very strong and muscular-looking, was in the bed. At first I did not know what to make of the new man. He looked so healthy and fit, and I was at a complete loss as to what might be wrong with him. Then gradually I began to realize that he was not moving at all. He was paralyzed from the neck down. Lying flat on his back, he stared at the ceiling. Only once did he turn his head in my direction. I said hello to him. He didn't answer, and his gaze went back to the ceiling. He blinked, and a tear, one he could not wipe away, slowly trailed down the side of his face. Nurses, orderlies, and other patients sometimes tried to talk to him. Only rarely would he respond, and then only with 1 or 2 word answers. He was all alone with his misery, and wanted to keep it that way. I felt a strange bond with this man. He was keeping everything locked up inside. Like me, for his own reasons, he did not want to, or could not, talk about what he was dealing with inside. Explaining what he was thinking and feeling was impossible. There was no one to whom he could turn for help. One morning there was a sudden flurry of activity, and through word of mouth I learned that the schoolhouse hospital was going to be inspected that afternoon. They look for malingerers, soldiers shirking duty by the pretending not to be well enough yet to fight, Nikolai told me. They also look for imposters, anyone not qualified to be in one of their wonderful military hospitals. And they check the staff to rate their performance and so forth. Nikolai lowered his voice to nearly a whisper. They are a bunch of pompous asses, communist bigwigs, stupid, self-important bureaucrats. Fear swept through me. Nikolai's words went around in my head. They also look for imposters. Certainly I fit the description. So far no one seemed to have noticed that I was different, that I was German. I had spoken little and very carefully. Even my mannerisms were very Russian, the way I shrugged, for example. So far, none of the staff or patients seemed to have detected anything unusual about me. But would I withstand the scrutiny of the inspectors, the government bigwigs, as Nikolai had put it, people who are actively seeking someone such as me? A horrid fantasy played in my head. In it, communists were pointing at me as I lay in bed, yelling at me, exposing me as a German. But I am half Russian, I would cry. I am as much Russian as I am German. Laughing, they would beat me to death with their fists. Is something wrong? Nikolai's head was turned in my direction. I realized I was gripping my bedding with both hands, and sweat had broken out on my brow. Are you all right? I said, just a cramp in the belly. He nodded. I wiped my brow, tried to relax. I looked out at the ward. In preparation for the visit, the staff was scurrying around, working even harder than usual to get everything in top shape. Even our doctors, Swarov and Rostovich, made a relatively rare appearance. Rostovich was even more nervous than usual and buzzed around like a wind-up toy, his words coming out mechanically, fast, as he ordered people around. Swarov, too, seemed a bit edgy, but it was the orderlies who seemed the most worried of all. One of them, a man named Yuri, even asked Rostovich if he could get into an unoccupied bed and pretend he was a patient. "Niet!" screeched Rostovich. "Definitely not!" Yuri disappeared briefly. When he returned, he had a bloody bandage that he had probably taken from the trash, wrapped around his head. Swarov told him to take it off. Yuri did as he was told. Why are the doctors and orderlies so scared? I asked Nikolai, trying to hide my own terror. If the doctors are found wanting, They may be sent to the front, to triage stations, which are far bloodier and more dangerous than here. His brow furrowed. I know I was in such a place for 2 days. As for the orderlies, if the inspectors decide that any of them are well enough, they will be sent back to fight and probably die. As it turned out, the officials did not make their visit until 2 days later. Lena, standing on her box, had just finished changing the dressings on my wounds and was emptying the jar of pink liquid into another larger jar. Outside, I saw a dust-covered car pull to a stop and a number of solemn-looking men get out. They went to the operating room first, but did not stay there long. Soon they entered our ward. The idiots have finally arrived, Nikolai whispered jeeringly. I watched the entry of the bunch, a general, a sergeant, a doctor carrying a medical bag, and a man in a black suit, whom Boris identified as a politico, a Soviet commissar. I was scared, but not as much as before. The reality was not as frightening as the fantasy. Finally, it was going to be over with, one way or the other. First, the orderlies, 11 of them, were made to line up for inspection. The doctors declared 8 of them fit to rejoin their units. One of these was Yuri. Looking like prisoners being marched off to the gallows, the sergeant led them away. Now comes the little show, Mikos whispered over his shoulder. Severe and self-important looking, the group made its way up and down the aisles between the beds, with Suvorov, Rostovich, and the nurses on their heels. I could hear them firing off questions about one thing after another. Dr. Suvorov and the nurses seemed rather composed, but Dr. Rostovich was so nervous it was ridiculous. His movements were jerky and unnatural, and his high-pitched, annoying voice could be heard all over the room as he stammered out the answers to questions. The politico carried a briefcase and had a list of some kind. Now and then he would whisper something in the general's ear. The contingent would stop. The dark-suited man would open his briefcase, and the general would pin a medal on the gown of a patient. Many of those receiving a medal seemed very pleased, but not a few appeared quite indifferent, almost scornful. My hands started to sweat. The group wound its way down our aisle. In one of the first beds was a recent arrival, a boy who had suffered a head wound. On the top of his shaved head there was a circle of stitches, which for some reason had been left unbandaged, and he just lay there, totally limp and completely unaware of anything. Regardless, the general pinned a medal on this brain-dead boy, as though he still had a brain after all. Nikolai and I exchanged glances, but said nothing. When I looked up again, the general was criticizing Dr. Suvorov about something. A heated discussion ensued, and the two walked away out of earshot. My attention shifted to the dark-suited man, a stoop-shouldered, eerie-looking character. Taking advantage of the moment, he was flirting with Tamara, the pretty young girl with long dark hair. She looked annoyed and was backing away, moving in my direction. "How would you like to work for me at the commissariat?" he was asking her. "Thank you, but I am needed here," Tamara replied. "You would be doing very important work," he flashed a gold-toothed grin. "I am already doing very important work, comrade. Don't you agree?" she said evenly, her dark, fathomless eyes fixed on him. The man persisted. His intentions toward the girl were obvious, and he continued to pursue her openly, despite the fact that he wore a wedding band, was old enough to be her father, and was making no progress at all with her. His flirting was finally brought to an end by the return of Dr. Suvorov and the general. The two seemed to have patched up their differences and were now chatting amiably. After a handshake, the general again commenced decorating the wounded soldiers. A boy with a great mop of shaggy blonde hair was extremely excited to receive a medal. Startling me, the green-uniformed officer turned my way, but the political tapped him on the shoulder and indicated the paralyzed man in the bed across the aisle. "You have served the people of the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics well, comrade," said the general as he pinned on the medal. "Your nation is proud of you," he saluted. The paralyzed man stared at the ceiling. "Take it off me, please," he said. For a moment the general paused. Then, as though he had not heard at all, he continued on. "Take it off!" yelled the paralyzed man. The general glanced sourly back at him. Then, after repeating his little speech, he decorated another soldier, conferred briefly with the politico, and then headed toward the exit. "I don't want it, you stupid fool!" cried the man, his voice filling the ward. "Get it off me!" The entourage stopped at the door. The general turned, showing a face red with anger and embarrassment, and looked back at the man. This time seemed to have stopped. The ward was silent. All eyes were on the general. "Please," muttered the man. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. Quietly, Tamara made her way to the paralyzed man and removed the medal. For an instant, the general looked as though he was going to charge at the girl and throttle her. But instead, he suddenly turned and stormed from the room, the other man on his heels. "Thank you," said the paralyzed man. Tamara wiped his tears. She bent over, kissed him on the cheek, then made her way down the hall that led to the operating room, the medal in hand. For a long while after she had left, the ward remained silent.